There's a rule sitting in a government filing cabinet right now that could put guns on more front porches in America than at any point in history, and the man who could profit most from it shares a last name with the president. You've probably scrolled past a dozen headlines about gun sales without realizing what's actually happening behind them. Everyone talks about the AR-15. Everyone talks about background checks. But almost nobody's connecting the dots between three things happening at the exact same time. A buying surge nobody predicted would last this long, a marketing playbook that turned one rifle into a cultural icon, and a policy change that could completely reshape how guns move through this country. By the end of this, you're going to understand exactly how those three forces fit together, and why what happens next affects you whether you own a gun or not. Let's start with the number that should stop you in your tracks. Between 2021 and 2024, years after the pandemic panic buying was supposedly over, nearly 30 million Americans acquired firearms, and more than 11 million of them were buying a gun for the first time in their lives. Now here's the part most people get wrong. They assume this was the same crowd, nervous suburban dads stocking up. It wasn't. A disproportionate share of these new owners were women, Hispanic Americans, and people of color, groups that historically weren't as prominent in traditional American gun culture. This wasn't just a niche hobby getting bigger, it was a demographic shift. But here's the problem. A lot of these buyers walked into homes that had never had a firearm in them before. Researchers estimate that around 7.8 million new owners introduced a gun into a previously gun-free household, newly exposing roughly 9 million adults and 6.6 million children to a firearm living under their roof. And that's not a statistic about crime. It's a statistic about millions of families changing something fundamental about their home environment without necessarily having years of experience thinking through what that means long term. So that's the demand side. Now let's talk about why one specific gun became the symbol of this entire boom. Because the answer isn't what you think. Most people assume the AR-15 became popular because it's the most powerful option on the shelf. It's not. Gun dealers who've been in the business for decades will tell you the opposite. The AR platform has relatively low recoil, it's accessible to new shooters, and, critically, it's highly customizable. And then there's the price. For years, buyers could find entry-level models at prices that made the platform accessible to a much wider market. But this is where it gets interesting. The rifle wasn't always this common. For an entire decade, 1994 to 2004, certain semi-automatic rifles and configurations were restricted under the federal assault weapons ban. When that ban expired and wasn't renewed, the AR-15 returned to a market that was already changing, and its image mattered almost as much as its mechanics. From there, the AR-15 stopped being just a product. It became an identity. Politicians started posing with them, churches started raffling them off, and Congress has even seen proposals to formally designate the AR-15 as the national gun of the United States. One firearms expert put it simply: for many younger buyers, the rifle's aggressive, military-style appearance isn't a drawback. It's part of the appeal. Show the same buyer a more powerful rifle with a traditional wood stock and no military aesthetic, and the interest can change dramatically. The gun didn't just sell because of what it does. It sold because of what it looks like and what it represents. Now zoom out with me for a second, because that surge in buyers and that surge in cultural symbolism didn't happen in a vacuum. They created pressure throughout the firearms market, and the federal government has spent years measuring another part of the story. Here's what most people get wrong about gun trafficking. They picture organized crime running weapons across state lines in the dead of night, but the data paints a more complicated picture. When the ATF conducted its first major national study of firearm trafficking investigations in more than 2 decades, reviewing 9,708 closed cases from 2017 through 2021, it found that some of the most common violations involved unlicensed dealing, straw purchasing, and illegal possession. In plain English, the problem isn't always a shadowy international network. Sometimes it's individuals exploiting weaknesses in a system that is supposed to prevent illegal transfers in the first place. And here's another surprise. More than half of those trafficking investigations remained within a single state, while only about a third involved interstate movement. That challenges the mental image many people have of how illegal firearms actually move. But that's not even the part that should get your attention most. When the ATF released additional findings on how firearms reach criminals, the numbers surrounding privately made firearms and illegally converted weapons became even more striking. Privately made firearms recovered at crime scenes increased dramatically between 2017 and 2023, and devices capable of illegally converting semi-automatic semi-automatic firearms into machine guns also appeared far more frequently in ATF investigations. The agency has described these developments as a serious threat to public safety and law enforcement. So now look at the bigger picture. You've got a massive wave of new buyers, a rifle that has become a cultural icon, and a trafficking landscape that's changing rapidly. Which brings us to the part that could reshape how firearms are sold in America. Under current federal law, buying a firearm online generally doesn't mean the gun simply arrives at your front door like an ordinary package. A federally licensed dealer must handle the transfer, including the required background check process. But a proposed regulatory change could alter how some of those transactions are completed. The proposal would allow licensed dealers to ship firearms directly to eligible buyers' homes under specified conditions, including identity verification, background checks, waiting requirements, and notification procedures. Sounds procedural, right? Here's why it isn't. The ATF has projected that a significant number of buyers could eventually choose home delivery instead of traveling to a dealer for pickup. And if that happens at scale, the way Americans purchase firearms could look very different. And here's the twist that makes this a story, not just a policy update. One company positioned to benefit from a more streamlined online firearms marketplace has been described as the Amazon of guns, and among the people connected to the company is the president's own son. That connection has attracted political attention and criticism from gun control advocates, who argue that moving more firearms directly toward residential delivery could create additional concerns involving theft, straw purchases, and trafficking. And those concerns matter because they're connected to the exact problems federal investigators have already been documenting. Which brings us to the biggest question. Think about what that actually means. The same federal investigations identifying straw purchasing and illegal dealing as major trafficking problems are happening at the same time. Policymakers are considering changes to how firearms move from licensed dealers to consumers. The question isn't simply whether someone can legally buy a firearm. It's what happens to the system around that purchase when the process becomes easier, faster, and more heavily centered around online transactions and residential delivery. That's the part almost nobody is connecting. Not the gun, not the buyer, the system underneath both of them, changing in real time. And there's one final point that ties everything together. Here's what you should walk away with. The gun market in America isn't driven by one thing. It's three forces moving together. First, a historic wave of first-time buyers who weren't part of the market at this scale 5 years earlier. Second, a rifle that became a cultural symbol through a combination of design, accessibility, marketing, and timing, not simply raw performance. And third, a potential regulatory shift that could change the friction involved in getting firearms from licensed sellers to consumers. Understand those three forces, and you understand where this is actually headed. Not the headlines, the mechanics underneath them, because that's where the real story is happening. And if you want to see how this plays out on the ground, which specific rifles and handguns are actually driving these sales numbers right now, that's exactly what the next video breaks down.